Hello. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Excellent. Hi and welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning and welcome to our mini conference, Arcs and Orbits, Relationality and Innovation. My name is Bahar Mohazabnia, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Engagement at Griffin Art Projects, and I will be co-moderating this conference alongside Dr. Karen Tam, our wonderful adjunct curator at Griffin Art Projects. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish Nations, to whom we are deeply grateful. As well, we would like to thank North Vancouver Recreation and Culture and the Friedby Foundation for their continuing support of our public programs. We are grateful to Christina Anthony and Odlum Brown for their sponsorship of Intersecting Orbits, Michael Morris, and Joan Balzar. And just a couple of quick notes. There is a gender-neutral washroom in the middle room there to the right. And if you wish to wear a mask, they're available at the front desk. At the end of each presentation, we open up the floor to a Q&A. We invite the audience as well as our in-person and online panelists to ask questions. And we invite you to ask your questions by just raising your hand, and either myself or Geraldine Yaris over here, our wonderful intern, will come over to you and pass over a mic. And this is just so the online panelists can hear, because they can only hear us from the mics. And just a quick note to try to keep it as close to your mouth as you can. You can see that it made a difference just as I raised it there. So just for good audio quality, to keep it at a good 90-degree angle. And with that, I pass over the mic to Dr. Karen Tam to introduce our online panelists.
Yeah. So my thanks as well for everyone to coming today, and I guess with the time change, we really appreciate that, your presence. And also hello and a thank you to Marie-Ève Beaupré and Julie Trudel for joining us from Montreal via Zoom for our first panel. So this mini conference not only explores the history and legacy of Joan Balzar and Michael Morris, as we will hear in the second panel with Bill and Wayne, but will also be a cross-regional conversation on the parallel development of abstract painting on the West Coast as well as in Quebec, as exemplified by Balzar, Morris, and Guido Molinari. It'll also touch upon the convergence of abstraction, light, and technology in contemporary painting, as we'll hear from Julie. So in our first panel, we have Marie-Ève Beaupré, followed by Julie. So I'll just give a quick bio of Marie-Ève. So she's the director of the Guido Molinari Foundation since 2023. Marie-Ève has collaborated with various institutions over the past 20 years. She was the curator of the collection at the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal from 2016 to 2023, and curator of the Contemporary Quebec and Canadian Art at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts from 2014 to 16. She also collaborated with the Musée National des Beaux-Arts du Québec from 2010 to 2014 and Galeries de l'UQAM from 2004 to 2012 on exhibition and research projects. As an art historian field practitioner, she has been involved in several inventories, including the studios of Edmund Allen, Sylvia Safdie, John Heward, Betty Goodwin, and Guido Molinari. So today, she'll be sharing insights into Molinari's work, his role in the development of abstract art in Quebec, as well as what the Foundation Molinari does, and her recent research into Michael Morris's Quebec links and sort of Molinari's links to the West Coast. And we might even get a sneak peek into Molinari's own private art collection. So thank you, and over to you, Marie-Ève.
Bonjour à chacune et chacun d'entre vous. It's a great pleasure to virtually join you today. I was kindly invited by Karen Tam to participate in this conference because of my deep interest in Canadian painting and the history of its development in this country. I must confess that I'm not a specialist in the work of Michael Morris, but I did care for his work at the MAC at the Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montréal when I was the curator in charge of the collection. I accepted this invitation because I also wanted to learn more about the work of Joan Balzar, whom I had never had the opportunity to discover before your exhibition. So bravo pour ça. Her work is that of a pioneer in our country who, alas, like many women artists, doesn't seem to have received the recognition she deserves. So I will propose you a few words, and the title of my presentation is Intersecting Canadian East and West Orbits Through the Contribution of Michael Morris, Joan Balzar, Guido Molinari, and Fernand Saint-Martin. So I propose to conduct this research as an historian, like you have said, Karen, as a field practitioner, as I like to say. I researched the collections and archives of Quebec museums, including those of the Molinari Foundation. I wanted to measure the influence of the work of Morris and Balzar in Eastern Canada. I wanted to understand, again, from the traces left in museum collections, I wanted to understand and document the influence of their work in Quebec, mainly during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to see what intersecting orbits were created between the artist communities in Quebec and British Columbia. So in these few words, I will humbly summarize the result of my research, which could be pursued, of course, and would benefit of a broader and deeper gaze on the subject. So by way of introduction, I would like to briefly present to you the Molinari Foundation, because we may not know this institution. I think it's relevant to share a few pertinent facts about this Montreal-based museum institution. So Guido Molinari is considered one of the most influential artists of contemporary Canadian painting, and as a painter, professor at Concordia University for 30 years, a poet, critic, and art theorist. He made a significant contribution to the development of non-figurative painting, as well as to the influence of geometric abstraction in Quebec. You may have seen his work in the collection of the Vancouver Art Gallery, which presented in 1989 a survey, an exhibition of his well-known black and white paintings. So Guido developed his career in the company of an equally important woman in Quebec art world. His wife was Fernand Saint-Martin, an art theorist, semiologist, museologist, writer, and critic, born in 1927. In the 50s, she was journalist with La Presse, editor-in-chief of the feminist magazine Châtelaine. She was a teacher at Université Laval and Université du Québec à Montréal. Fernand was also the director of the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal from 1972 to 1977. Together, Guido and Fernand founded the important Galerie L'Actuelle in 1955, the first Canadian art gallery devoted to non-figurative painting and sculpture. Together, they presented dozens of avant-garde exhibitions in Montreal between mainly 1955 and 1957, even before the creation of the Ministère de la Culture and the MAC, the Contemporary Art Museum in Montreal, that were founded in 1964. So they were 10 years earlier working in the field of non-figurative art. So the Foundation Molinari, they created following their death, acquires, preserves, documents, and promotes the work of Guido, of course, We take care of nearly 1,700 works. The foundation also preserves 780 works by other artists collected by Guido and Fernand over the years. So this collection enables us to understand many of their friendships with the artists they knew and supported. So using the collection as a kind of lever, the foundation promotes the history of non-figurative art and geometric abstractions in Quebec, Canada, and internationally, of course. So for us, research is fundamental in driving and structuring our activities. So the foundation presents a diversified annual program of exhibitions, lectures, concerts, and cultural, educational, and mediation activities. Since its opening 10 years ago, over 50 exhibitions have been presented and 19 artist residencies have taken place. Because yes, for over 10 years, the foundation has welcomed artists in residency, and we were very privileged to welcome Julie Trudel last year at the Fondation. She will show you beautiful pictures of the fantastic group show she curated with her colleagues. We also welcome researchers at the foundation and curators wishing to develop projects with an historical conscience. So the foundation's aim is to promote trans-historical dialogues and to offer artists and curators the chance to revisit corpus of art history with a contemporary gaze. So it means that an exhibition like Intersecting Orbits is precisely the type of exhibition we love to curate. So that's why I'm very pleased with you today. So as the keeper of a collection consisting of 15 linear meters of documentary archives, the foundation preserves significant material that reveals the history of art in Quebec, including hundreds of epistolary files containing handwritten letters spanning over more than 5 decades. Paul-Émile Bordua, Dorothy Cameron, Claude Gauvreau, Rita Le Tendre, Robert Holland Murray, Barnett Newman, Rudolphe de Repentigny, Jean-Paul Riopel are among those who corresponded with Molinari and Fernand Martin, Saint-Martin over the years. So I revisited our collection, I was saying, our library, because we own 200 books and exhibition catalogs collected by Guido and Fernand. And I also revisited epistolary archives between Molinari and his contemporaries to see if I could find any material to express networks of affinity and relationships of complicity between Molinari, Fernand, Maurice Balzar, as they belong pretty much to the same generation. So we have to keep in mind that on the west side, let's say, Joan Balzar was born in 1928, and on the east side, Fernand Saint-Martin was born in 1927. Michael Morris, a bit younger, was born in 1942, and Guido Molinari, 1933. Michael and his mother, Rita, immigrated from England to Vancouver in 1946. Molinari's family immigrated from Italy at the beginning of the 30s. Even if Fernand and Joan was the same generation, I said, and I want to underline the fact that it was a very challenging time for women who wanted to develop a professional career. I was impressed to learn through my research that Rita, Michael's mother, taught art classes at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria in the 50s and 60s. She's a real pioneer too in her way, through her collection, but also through the position she has developed and embraced with her community. In the 50s, Molinari and Fernand opened this gallery called L'Actuel, but no artists from the West were shown in this context. But I found out a lot of connections between Molinari and Michael Morris in the 60s through the MAC and the Guido Molinari archives. I've found out that a few dates that I could share because we know that Joan Balzar graduated from the Vancouver School of Art in 1958, and in the 60s, after taking courses at Victoria College, Michael Morris began studies at the Vancouver School of Art with Jacques Chalbot, which is very well represented in Quebec collections, and Roy Kiuka, who became, what I understand, like a friend of Molinari and Fernand, because Kiuka, Roy, joined the Vancouver School of Art as a teacher in 1959, but moved to Montreal in 1965 with his family to become teacher at Concordia, where Molinari was also teaching. I explain this fact and the fact that in the collection of the Molinari Foundation, we have two beautiful works on paper by him. But in the 60s, in precisely 65, Molinari was part of this well-known exhibition Responsive Eye, curated at MoMA with Canadian artists Agnès Martin and Claude Tousignan. But in 1965, it was also the year of the presentation of the 6e Biennale d'Ottawa that was curated by the National Gallery of Ottawa and shown at the Contemporary Art Museum. In this show, in 1965, Molinari and Morris were participating. So we can maybe consider that they have met each other through this event because following his studies in British Columbia in 1965, Morris moved to London to undertake a postgraduate work at the Slade School of Art and studied with Ron Kitaj and Harold Cohen. And it's very interesting because Harold Cohen, which was one of the main teachers in London of Morris, also had a solo show at the MAC a few years later in 1968. And probably because he was the one leading the Emma Lake workshop in 1966. But of course, we can guess that Molinari and Harold Cohen and Morris had this potential connections and maybe dialogues in person during those years. Following this presentation of Morris, the first presentation of Morris' work at the MAC in 65, in 1967, the project Centennial Suite included a series of 13 prints commissioned by Simon Fraser University. So this project was representing works, including works by Maxwell Bates, Jan Baxter, Claude Breeze, Audrey Capel-Doré, Brian Fisher, John Corner, Michael Morris, Tony Onler, Jack Chalbot, Gordon Smith, Joel Smith, and Takao Tanabe. Most of these artists are represented in the MAC collection at that time. This project, this book, was organized as a centennial gift, and the book was given to major museums across Canada by the SFU at that time. The project also became an exhibition, and Michael Morris was the youngest of the group. So he was showing in 67, very early in his career, with his former teachers, Maxwell Bates and Jack Shackbutt. That's interesting to underline. So this portfolio of the 13 British Columbia artists was acquired by the MAC in 1968, but also by international institutions. I found out one copy of the book in the Tate collection, as well as in other important Canadian institutions, like the National Gallery or the Musée National des Beaux-Arts in Quebec. We can understand that Morris pursued his work with Prince in 68 and have probably visited Montreal at that time, because the year after, the MAC bought two other works on paper of him. One great print from 1968, Motown, and another one, Palomar, also made the same year. So those two works were maybe bring back from British Columbia by him, or maybe was shipped, but the same year in 68, I suppose it was one of the moments where we can find a lot of connections between the two orbits. What I mean is that the MAC bought two extra works of Morris, but also invited him in a group show curated at the museum. So in 1968, we have to keep in mind that the collection of the MAC is very young. The museum was opened in 1964, and in 1968, the collection was made of only 500 works, and only 150 artists, Canadian artists, were part of the collection. So it means that at a very early age, in 1968, the Morris was well represented through the artist book, but also with the purchase. It was not a donation. The purchase of two extra works that were shown at the MAC in Montreal in a group show called Recent Acquisitions. And once again, like in 65 for the Biennale, in 68, this group show, Recent Acquisitions, was including works of Molinari and Morris, among several other artists. In 68, at the beginning of the year, one of the mentors of Morris was a part of also a solo exhibition at the MAC. Harold Cohen, who was a teacher, like I said earlier, of Morris in England, had a solo show. And I have an extract of the press release published by the MAC in 1968. So they were introducing Harold Cohen as a British painter of international reputation. And the MAC, the museum, was saying that he was one of the artists who, from 1950 onwards, led the younger generation of painters to question British pictorial art. So today, avant-garde British painting is inconceivable without the reconsideration of the problem of the pre-1950 period, which was mirrored in forms comparable to those of social realism. So the artist, Harold Cohen, was introduced to the community in Montreal as the one who has enabled the young people of today to produce art that is symbolic and significant of the society in which they live. I think it's very interesting, considering that he was one of the teachers of Morris. The same year, so the MAC bought some works of Morris. Molinari and Fernand bought some works from Kiuka. Same year, in 1968, the MAC also presented a group show entitled Painting 66 in British Columbia. So this group show that was curated at La Cité du Havre au musée was this exhibition prepared by Arnold Rockman for the of the Art Gallery of Vancouver. Is an inventory of new pictorial explorations by artists in the Vancouver region. Dynamic and isolated, these are Rockman's impressions of Vancouver's cultural life in 1966. This is from the press release. In the introduction of the exhibition catalog, he also notes that the best works produced in British Columbia seem to be at the forefront of the artistic movement throughout the country, and that while the art of Toronto and Montreal often seems to be a distorted reflection of New York and even more so of Paris, that of Vancouver appears to be the counterpart of that of London and Los Angeles, and that some of the works presented in the exhibition seem to prefigure the evolution of art in the great capitals that are its headquarters. So same year, 1968, we can confirm that the community of Vancouver, of British Columbia in a broader way, was very well represented in the East, especially at the MAC. Molinari and Fernand, of course, were working very closely with the museum. So that's why I was curious. I've not found any correspondence of or letters between the three together, but I had the feeling they have probably met in town. Later on, in the 70s, it's interesting to put in perspective other facts. In 1971, it's the year of the creation of the Society of Limners, this group of like-minded creative individuals living in Victoria. The year after, on the east side of our large country, 1972, it was the creation of Véhiculaire, one of the first artist-run center in the country, based in Montreal, who was effective and active to 1983. The year after, 1973, it was the creation of the Western Front on the West Coast by 8 artists, among them Kate Craig, Glenn Lewis, Eric Metcalfe, Michael Morris, and Vincent Trasov will be represented in the MAC collection very early. I would like also to point to put in perspective the fact that a few letters after, in 1980, Michael Morris had his first solo show at the MAC. It was an exhibition called Photographie with hundreds of photos, slides, and videos produced between 1970 and 1980. And the show was accompanied by a catalog. The curator was Claude Gosselin. A few years later, in 1984, there was a very important show that was called Western Front Video that was curated also at the MAC in Montreal. It was an exhibition organized to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Western Front Society. 19 works from this community, pioneers, 19 of their works were shown, works mostly produced in this between 1976 and 1984. And it's very rare, but all the works part of this show, of this group show, have been acquired through purchase by the MAC. So the Western Front video exhibition was one of the first show of video, of course, but also these acquisitions were among the first videos who entered in the MAC collection. It's interesting to point out that René Blouin and Peggy Gale were part of the curatorial project. And we have to keep in mind that René Blouin was one of the leaders around Véhiculaire in 1972. So these are a few dates that were, I think, that are very interesting to put in perspective. But during the 80s also, on the other part, Guido Molinari had a solo show at the VAG. The black and white paintings were shown, and a catalog also was produced by the institution. In 1992, the MAC reopened on the main site that we know now at Place des Arts. And in this, when the MAC moves to Place des Arts site in downtown Montreal, they organized this major, huge exhibition to celebrate the reopening. An extensive 600 pages catalog was produced with the exhibition, and video works by Michael Morris and Vincent Trasov were included in the exhibition and very well documented in the publication. And I can read and yeah. So still in the 90s, the museum continued to show the work. So I don't want to be too long because I feel it's already a lot of info. And yeah, I will be very pleased to pursue the conversation with you later today.
Merci beaucoup pour cette belle présentation. Thank you so much. Like, I can't wait till we get to the conversation, discussion, Q&A. I'll just move to our second speaker, Julie Trudel. Just a quick bio. She's a Montreal visual artist who subscribes to an extended definition of painting and whose practice is part of a reflexive and conceptual painting approach. She seeks to update traditional concerns of abstract painting through a renewal of its technical means in terms of the medium, support, and spatial layout. Her most recent plexiglass works are an exploration of the effects of ambient light on color. Her works have been exhibited throughout Canada, in Europe, and the US, and have also been included in 2 major survey shows of contemporary Canadian art painting. She's represented by Galerie Hugues Charbonneau in Montreal. And as a painting professor at Université du Québec at Montréal, she co-founded a research group focusing on light, the Labo Lumière, Création et Recherche Interdisciplinaire. So with that, I'll pass the mic to Julie.
Thanks, Karen. Okay. I was managing my screens. Okay, so yeah, I was also really happy to be invited to present in this symposium, although it's a bit intimidating to be sharing with quite distinguished curators. I'm more of an artist. As Karen said, I'm also a professor. She asked that I present my art practice, and that's what I'll be trying to do, but with the intention of also making some links with Vancouver and the history of abstract paintings, and also with Michael Morris and Joan Balzar, who I had never heard of before I was invited. So I titled my presentation, In Search of Unseen Colors, Rationality and Innovation in My Painting Practice. And so first of all, I'll be briefly touching on my art practice. I began as a painter, and as a painter, I'm fascinated by, I have to say that I was always fascinated by the capacity of painting to give a very rich sensory experience and maybe defining a bit the way we perceive things. And for me, painting, I don't see it as an image or an object, but more as a discipline. So when I started as a painter, I was I'm always thinking in my projects of which painter before me has tackled such and such issues. And I was always very taken by this idea of innovation in abstract painting. That is, the way I approach it is a bit of a necessity. And I see the painting that it should be a result of an experiment that surprises me and the viewer at the same time. So the whole history of the abstract paintings, I'm really interested in this idea of research. And while the up art movement were doing some research about colors that was very cutting edge at the time. I feel very close to some contemporary painters that are adopting an analytical attitudes, and I was part of my work was part very recently after I graduated from my MFA. I was part of a survey of abstract painting that Galeries l'UQAM had put together, and I think Marie-Ève was part of the curating team at the time. And they were trying to define a certain take on painting at the time in 2013. And they were saying that they titled it painting as a subject. So they were saying that this type of painting, the artist looks at the how a painting, oh, I'll read it, it'll be easier. Painting as a subject brings together practices in which the how determines the what of painting, shaping the works through the use of quotation, gestural language, or abstraction. The characteristics of painting itself as a material and as an art form with a history constitutes the very essence of art. So this is a way of discussing the type of painting I'll be doing. And also I was invited by David McWilliams, the curator of the show right now, to be part of another survey in Vancouver at the VAG in 2017. And David was defining abstract conceptual painting, saying it's typically a rigorous inquiry into painting as a subject, and often more specifically into the formal qualities of painting, including systematic procedure and processes, an interrogation of the act of painting, and examination of the support, the problem of color as a necessary condition of paint, and the reality of a painting as a unique and differentiated art object. So it's a bit the attitude I have in my art practice. And when I first started, I worked a lot with the color of printmaking, silkscreen, and I tend to work with protocols as a way to search the material deeply. It's a bit of a paradox. I very often work with materials that are very standardized, but I'm trying to use an approach where I would search it to have something emerge that we feel it was not seen before. So I worked for several years with the pure color of silkscreen that I was diluting with large amounts of acrylic paint. And I had developed a process of pouring the paint from that measuring cup we just saw, drop by drop, on wood panels, the drop starting from the outside of the painting. So the color were purer from the outside, as we can see here, and then it was becoming more and more mixed through the cup that was emptying and the color overlapping each other's in the cup and outpouring. And the way I work is I'm doing many tests, sometimes with protocols, trying to work all of the variations, but sometimes also intuitively with paints leftovers and trying to use also the mistakes. And it's a bit of a intimate research I do with the materials. My work tend to be at the same time very controlled, but paradoxically trying to have some kind of chance involved. So this was the body of work I presented for my thesis exhibition in 2011. It's already a while ago. And in a project, I usually try to work different variations. So maybe this series, every paintings was a different recipe with the CMYK inks. And the titles often reflects that aspect of protocol in the work. So I'll be just showing images of the works after. So this occurred as a mistake on the table, which at the time I didn't take a photograph of, but I recreated for the PowerPoint at some point. And then with this test piece, I was chosen for the RBC painting competition, and I got the opportunity to get out of Montreal for the first time and travel to Edmonton and Toronto as part of this show and meet with other artists from across Canada, which was very unusual for me at the time. But it was the beginning of my interest in trying to know the painting scene across Canada better. So I developed different bodies of work over time, trying to work these questions through a shape canvas. And at some point, I felt I had turned around this project enough, and I got interested into black and white thinking. It was a really interesting way of continuing the project, as it was the color of optical art, basically, because it creates a lot of depth of space in a painting. So I bought all of the black and white pigments I could found out and tried to research the pigments using different dilutions with a very lot of acrylic paint, transparent acrylics. And it led to another body of work. Yeah. I won't say much about these body of works. It's been a while now. And then I won the Joseph Plaskett Award. I learned during my research for this presentation that Joe Plaskett was a mentor of Joan Balzar. And he's an artist from the West Coast who has put together a painting prize for a young artist to travel in Europe and has a life-changing experience. So I think in 2013, I won the Joe Plaskett Award in painting, which allows me to travel for a year in Europe. And as part of that year, or no, maybe it was just a little bit prior, I've been to a residency in France where I started to work with drops of paints, maybe subconsciously influenced by the Vassarelli Foundation pieces I saw in this trip. And these works were made by torquing the panels and having a coat of paint moving across, taking the drop with it, stretching the coat of paint. And during my Plaskett year, I traveled to Berlin and also to Bordeaux, where in a residency, I made these paintings that were shown in the David's show at the VAG in 2017. So this body of work is made in plexiglass panels for technical reasons. It's a body of work that I made pouring coats of paints and then the drops, and then torquing the panels so that the drop moves around at the same pace. And then taking the paint out of the panel and letting it to dry very flat in all one session of work. And that way, like the painting kind of looks like it was a bit digital, or it appears like that in the work. The plexiglass background made it possible that the work stays flat during the drying process, because otherwise it would torque on wood panels, maybe MDF panels, it would torque. So then when I was in Berlin in the residency during my plasket year, I got interested in the plexiglass and asking myself what I could do with it, because it has both sides, and I kind of fell in love with this fluorescent plexiglass, who's very much connotated with design maybe, but I was challenged to try to use it in a pictorial way. So I researched and had this idea from the beginning to work with overlappings of the color of the background of the wall and the color of the plexi and the color of the paint over it. And I was also thinking of Joseph Albert's homage to the square, like the variations of the color in a painting practice. But I was really dissatisfied with the results of my experiments at the time, because I felt the most interesting thing was occurring on the wall behind the painting. And taken by maybe some kind of insatisfaction, I got this idea of maybe folding the panel to have the light come through the panels. So I made an exhibition who I see now as a transition exhibition between the work I was doing prior and the work I'm doing right now. And these paintings, I was also using the drops in acrylic paints, but they were a bit like abstract altar pieces that were catching the light from the inside and projecting it on the painted side. And just showing that the trickiest part in these pieces are the folding that occurs after the painting is completed and could basically destroy the painting if not successful. So then it takes me to my current works that work with fluorescent acrylic. And I was using a slight gradient of a transparent acrylic, either black or white, on the panels. And right from the beginning, I had this idea of overlapping the panels. And then after a few years of research, that's the result of the exhibition I made at Galerie Hugues Charbonneau in 2019. So on one wall, the paintings were on a white background, and on the other on a black background. And I was interested in the color combination that were occurring between the meeting of the background color, the color of the acrylic plexiglass, and also the color of the painted part. The whiter part here is painting. So some of them has a white painting, and so the edges are fluorescent because the plexiglass catches the lights from the side, and the hanging system is custom made so that it fits the shape of all of the different panels. So these were the square, like the folded squares of Joseph Albert, I guess. And all of the reflections as you turn around are very much part of these works for me. So this was a triptych, and there was a similar triptych facing on the other side. We can see here the coat of paint. So on the other side, the other triptych appears a very different color, but it's mainly because of the background that is different. And these pieces, the circles, are the last I made. There's no paint on it. It's only plexiglass. And I was interested in the gradient that occurs on the edge as the fluorescent red and yellow show through the blue and creates this gradient. So this body of works was quite challenging to do, but it opened up an idea of working with mirror plexiglass. So I bought 3 colors of mirror plexi, and this material is made of a plexiglass, like the red part on the chart is the acrylic per se, the plexiglass. And behind is a coat of aluminum, and then it's protected by a coat of paint. So what I did for this new exhibition is that I didn't use paint. I only work subtracting either the painting coat or the aluminum film as well, or sanding a bit the plexiglass to get different finish. So I work a lot with samples that I move around in the studio, but I also work with small scale models that I developed this technique with gels, acrylic gels for light shows, for light projectors that could match the exact color of the plexi. So it allows me to do a lot of prototypes on a model, and then work on small scale prototypes. And right from the beginning, I had this idea of joining the 3 color panels to create different colors. But then it would only work if there were air between the panels. If they were stuck together, it didn't really work. So I ended up with these paintings and wanted to show in natural light in my studio. It's much more alive than in a gallery. But that's how the show ended up. Yeah, so the big sculpture in the center, I see it more as a 3D painting in a way. And it's all the different colors would create new colors in the reflection in between. This triptych is a bit of an homage to Donald Judd, and it happens in anyway. And these were 2 different takes on the same idea, but one with the white background and on the black background. And there was a third, the reflections of the work between themselves was very much part of the show as well. You were always taken with different angles. And this is the last, last paintings. So I'm running a little bit out of times. I wanted to finish by showing maybe a few images of 2 other projects. I'll be maybe taking 3 minutes that are not totally mine. I made a project with Nancy Bussière, who I work with in Labo Lumière at UQAM. She's a scenograph, so she's working with lights for theaters and dance shows. And we did a show together with my paintings. She developed light scores for my paintings. So these are shows of it just to show you what the dispositif look like. But I want to show a short excerpt of the works of these light scores. I'll show a small excerpt maybe later. Okay. Okay, so this is the one I wanted to show. So this is one of the painting. It's the light score that was designed for it. And Nancy is working a lot with the eye. So how the eye can absorb a certain type of lights, and then it changes the way you perceive. She uses the black also as well. and then very subtle changes in the colors and the shift in the light. Okay, so this gives an idea of the project, and I wanted to show, because of Michael Morris was very much part of groups of artists and artist-run practices. I wanted to show a project I did at Fondation Molinari, where Marie-Ève works. It's a show we've done together at the artists. We are curated a show about color. So special way of working with color in Montreal. So we're 5 artists based in Montreal, trying to work with color in the tradition maybe of Quebec abstract painting. And we included a Molinari piece in the show. So this is Karine Fréchette's work, the big Molinari painting, and Yannick Raymond, who works with printers and real paint mixed together. Luce Meunier, who works a lot with pouring processes as well. I did a collab piece with Nancy Bussière, a light sculpture. And also Nicolas showed his studies for his larger painting, Nicolas Grenier. And this is a Molinari painting in relationship with Luce works. So thanks a lot. That was all.
Thank you, Julie, for this beautiful presentation as well, really dynamic. We'll have a short Q&A session. Can I invite Bill and Wayne to come up and join us to maybe have a conversation with Julie and with Marie-Ève, if you don't mind? And then we'll also take audience questions too and your input. So I guess like maybe I'll just start with one question to Marie-Ève. I'm curious actually just to, if you could share with us like your own path and connection with Molinari and the Fondation and how you came there.
In my path, I've had the great pleasure to collaborate with artists from different generations. I'm very interested with like real contemporary, like current practices, but also I've worked for artists like Betty Goodwin, and also I've worked for Molinari at the very beginning of the foundation 20 years ago. So I suppose your question may be about this because as an art historian, like others, I've worked to inventory some artist studios, and Molinari was the first experience in my parcours. So 20 years ago already, before it was an official museum, I've had the pleasure and the privilege to go through the entire collection, and I was so impressed by of course the quality of his work, but I was also very impressed by the importance of his community, his affinities in his collection. Then when I went through the entire body of work of other artists, I realized that Molinari and Fernande, the two together, were closely connected to their entourage. So over 50 years or so, they have acquired works of young artists, their students, good friends like Claude Tousignan, but also John Cage, who was invited to perform in Montreal because Molinari and Fernand had L'Actuel, but also bring some shows from Montreal to New York, to the East Hampton Gallery, and they were bringing back artists from New York in Montreal. So the North and South trade road, the trail between the two cities was open because of their contribution. So it's one of the aspects I've realized when I've done this research inventory in the studio.
Thank you. Just wondering, Bill, Wayne, if you had any thoughts from the two presentations or, yeah. Perhaps like some of what Marie-Ève's research into like Michael's connections in Montreal or, yeah.
I'm particularly interested in Julie's investigation with color and the other 5 artists that are working in, I presume, the Montreal area with color, wondering as well on the historical background for work like that, precedents. And I'm thinking of the color bar research that Michael Morris and Vincent Trassoff and actually others through a performative exercise were involved in. And I would think there would be similar exercises in Quebec and in Montreal in the 70s. Just wondering if there's any influence from that period on the new investigations in color and transparency of materials, reflection, mirrored reflections, etc. That sound very familiar.
Can you say a little bit? Can you say a little bit more about this experiment you're talking about from Michael Morris and his peers?
Well, I'll show something in my talk, and I'm sure, and Bill might also refer to the kind of investigations in color and form, performativity in urban and rural settings. Perhaps there is no parallel research in the 70s in Quebec, but it's just kind of interesting to see a revival in interest in mirrored surfaces, space and the use of space in that I was getting echoes of another period here on the West Coast.
Yeah.
Just wondering if there was another generation from the 70s that act as precedents for your own investigations in color.
Yeah, what I would say about what I can say about that is in terms of my own art practice, about at the same time I started to work with the plexiglass, I did a residency where artists told me about the light and space movement, which I had never heard of prior. So I researched these artists. At the time, I was struggling with trying to find out a way to use the plexi in an interesting ways. So that was part of the things I thought about. And also, not only the light and space movement, the idea just flew my mind. I can see myself in the background of View 4, so it's a bit disturbing to see myself speaking. But yeah, so that part of the plexiglass is more the light and space that I looked at, but more also contemporary artists like Olafur Eliasson and others who are working with glass and transparency. But in terms of Montreal, what I can say of this project I show with the other painters is that it's a project we developed over a 3-4 year period of time. And it started with studio meetings and conversations because we felt that color was very important in Montreal painting, but very rarely discussed per se. It's a bit difficult to talk about colors. We have a vocabulary to talk about image and shape and blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to naming color relationships, we feel a bit cramp. And so by doing these studio meetings over time, maybe 3-4 times a year, the discussion evolved, and what has come out of this was two major influences in the color. We felt that the art history of Montreal, especially Molinari, Yves Gaucher, Claude Tousignan, all of these people, for us, when we were young painters, they were seen as the heroes of abstract paintings in Montreal. So it sets the bar very high. But then on a contemporary perspective, as young painters, we feel that the two major influences are, on one side, the screen, like the colors of the screen that are really like overwhelming and everywhere nowadays, but also the nature. So and colors in the real life is always changing. You're fascinated by the sunset because the colors are shifting, changing, moving, and same thing with the screen. But then as a painter, you work with material that is static and very not moving. So that's the main angle we found out between our practices.
Thank you. That was really well done.
Hi, Julie. I have a short question that probably deserves a short answer. And it's my sense that the plexi works, whether they were made by you or made by someone else, would not be shown at a dealer here. They might get a show at some kind of museum, because I just can't imagine that people on the West Coast would be purchasing them. So can you say something about what happened with sales from things that you made over the past, 10 years, or sales, sales from the group show?
Yeah, my work with the plexi is very difficult to sell, I have to say. My poor dealer is struggling a bit with this. But on my side, I don't lose faith. No, anyway, yeah, it's difficult to sell because not only the materials are not typical, but also the institutions as well have some kind of bad experience with the plexiglass and sees it as a material that doesn't last over time. Whether on my side, I think that this material might last longer than many others, but we'll see.
We've got a question from David. So,
Hi, Julie and Maria. Thank you both for your presentations. Really interesting. For some reason, my mind is stuck in the 60s, and I'm thinking a lot about light shows that used to happen in Vancouver, down on Pender Street and in certain locations in the past, and in seeing, Julie, the work you're doing now in terms of light, plexiglass, and projections. I'm wondering how much you've thought about sound, and sound in relation to light shows, because it seems like what you're moving towards is a kind of a multimedia experience that we have come to know through music and multi-sensorial sound and light. And I wondered if you could comment at all on that.
Yeah, the sound in my collaboration with Nancy, the sound is a bit of topic of a controversial topic, collaborating with her, because she comes from the theater. She sees the sound as something that enhances the experience. It's really a given in this field to have sound in this type of work. And we've tried both. And I think, Maria, you witnessed one of the trials we made at Galerie de l'UQAM in the residency with the sound. And we were unsatisfied. I was, as a painter, I see the work more powerful when it's silent in a way. I see the sound as maybe something a bit disturbing or taking the experience somewhere else, maybe a bit too directive as an experience. And so we tried both. At the beginning, we had a composer who experimented with us, and we decided to remove the sound from the show we did. And the whole show was 25 minutes, the whole experience of looking one painting after the other. It was a sequence. They were not acting at the same time. It was a very slow experience. And then Nancy is not satisfied with that. She wants to take the sound back. So one of our next project, she's now on a maternity leave, but when she come back, the next step in this collaboration will be to find someone to work the sound with us. But it will be a real challenge because we see it very differently. And I feel that so that this project continues to be a painting project, it will have to be used in a way that I don't really know what it will be.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question, and we have sandwiches in the back.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I found it really helpful. The question was for Marie-Ève. You mentioned there was a show in 67 or 68 of British Columbian artists at the MAC in Montreal, but I don't know that you've mentioned who were the artists represented in that show. So I don't know if you can maybe bring some light on that a little bit.
Yes, with pleasure. There's so many more information I would love to share, but I think it was already a lot of data presented. But in this exhibition curated at the MAC in 1968, it was an exhibition prepared by the Art Gallery of Vancouver to represent the cultural life of the Vancouver scene in 1966, and the artists that were part of this show were Kate Boyle, Bruce Bruce Corner, toutes les œuvres présentées, Roy no, here, because they were works from San Francisco, Montréal, and then the list of those artists. I want to give you the, Morris was part of it, and I'm sorry, I have the info here. Voilà, so Ian Baxter, Jack Ackroyd, Ross Bullrup, Claude Breeze, Leonard Brett, Tom Burrows, Audrey Capel-Doré, Brian Fisher, Brent Gifford, John Greer, Richard Halliday, Reginald Holmes, Gary Lee Nova, David Myers, Michael Morris, Bodo Pfeiffer, Jack Chabot, Gordon Smith, Harry Andrew Stanbridge, John Taylor, and Carolee Thompson. So yes, mostly male artists, only 1-2 women, but it was an important group show. Several acquisitions were also have been made in this project, and it was there was a catalog also for the show.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Marie-Ève, Julie. We're going to break now for 15 minutes, right? Maybe, and feel free to grab a coffee, tea, sandwiches, cookies, and then we'll be back in at 12:45.
Test.
Hi, everyone. We're just going to start shortly. So if you could all kindly take to your seats and we can introduce Bill. Hello, hello. If I could kindly ask everyone to take their seats so we can begin the second part of the presentations. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone had a chance to get a quick bite to eat before we dive back in. Without any further ado, I will introduce our next speaker, Bill Jeffries. BJ is a part-time maker of pictures who has taken breaks from those endeavors to run a photo gallery, Cobra Gallery, the Contemporary Art Gallery, Presentation House Gallery, the Simon Fraser University Art Galleries, as well as several positions at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and finally, as the director of the Gordon Smith Foundation and its art gallery, all from the years of 1982 to 2007. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for the quick summary of my life. Some of the people that I talked to during the lunch break said that they really didn't know anything about Joan at all. So if there are copies of the catalog left on the table, there's a picture of Joan right inside the front cover, 1967, working at Neon Products, so that we now could see a painting with strips of neon on it. If she looks very well dressed to you in this image, that is the only way that I ever knew her. I never saw her in studio painting clothing. Did she change clothing ever? No. No. So like dressed, dressed to the nines, even when working in the studio. So the title of this talk, you may have a title that I didn't make up, but the title that I made up is a quote from Joan, and it's one that puts the knife into anyone who wants to make paintings of nature. So the title of the talk is, I Just Can't Get Into Trees. And sorry, group of 7 and a whole lot of BC West Coast painters, but that's how Joan felt about things. The talk, to the extent that it has any kind of structure at all, is more or less chapters. It's not linear. I kind of skip around, and I've tried to do it in inverse pyramid style because I have no real idea how long it'll take to do. So sound check, is it okay? Better? Better? Yeah, okay. First I want to give credit where credit is due. So I learned about Joan via the solo show that Scott Watson gave her at the Belkin Satellite in 2003. And it was at that show's opening that I met Joan for the first time. So it was Scott's insight that Joan's painting needed to come out of the closet, as it were. That was the seed for all of her subsequent exposure. And as has happened in my wanderings here today, people just didn't know about Joan for a very long period of time. And in some cases, even after the various shows that happened. So when I showed her paintings in 2011 at SFU, my first impulse did not stem from the urge to give her a show. It was that there wasn't a single publication. There was absolutely nothing that you could find in print that would explain anything about what she was trying to do. So I wanted to do a book, but as those of you who run art galleries know, in order to make it all work, you have to do a show also so that the budget for the book climbs onto the budget for the show without anyone noticing that that's what you're really doing. But it was great to do the show, but it meant that people had to go up to Burnaby Mountain in order to see Joan's work. And I think some people here did. So the book was printed on SFU's own press. Most people don't know that it had one. I think it's gone now, which is part of a kind of printing facility that was mainly used for printing course book material for students that was photocopied. And there was this nice guy who ran the press. And when this little book came out, he was sort of like, oh, this is terrific. We're going to be able to get more money from the university because it looks really good. So he had never probably seen a really well-printed art book in his life, but he was quite buzzed by what he managed to pull off. The three sidebar things that you should know about Joan is that in 1970, she had a fire in her home and studio. And as far as I know, all the work that was in the studio at that time was lost. So if you see work of hers somewhere and it has the 1960s date, that basically means it was somewhere else. It had been sold to someone or it was at her home or whatever. And so that tragedy was then followed by the second tragedy, which was more or less 30 years of no shows, certainly 30 years of no solo exhibitions, and which takes us into the 2003 show at the Belkin. And the other thing, which I've only learned more or less recently from Joan's niece, and something that I didn't know, is that Joan's studio, studio atmosphere, in which if she had music on, I would have thought she would have had music by, Audubon or, Metallica or something like that, something with beams. Anyway, she listened to opera. So all the paintings that you see were produced just listening to opera while she was working in the studio, which is kind of cool. I have a second bigger aside, and that is that there's something that's been bugging me for a long time, and this is like an occasion to bring it up. And that is that it's my sense that there's been a really big influence on the art in this city and the art galleries in this city by people who came from Victoria. And I don't have a list. I'm hoping that someone here who is thinking of doing an MA thesis or something can see this as an opportunity. But, there was a time, I was trying to think about what we had. We had the front. So that was mainly people who came over from Victoria. We had Grunt Gallery. We had Vanguard magazine, which was more or less founded in its real form, in which it was glossy, by Russell Kezier, who came from Victoria. It was Access Gallery, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the quirks of the show is that it reminds us, or reminds me anyway, that somebody needs to research the influence of people from Victoria on our art scene here, and especially on the school system, because I have the sense that people came out of the school system, all of them smarter about visual art than almost anybody who came out of other school systems around. And I don't know if it's true or not, but it just seems like a research area. And Joan moved to Victoria when she was 5, so she was a product of all of that. So we have these two Victoria expats, as it were, Joan and Michael, and they do have a lot in common. But one other thing that's been bugging me about them is that I was trying to figure out what the big difference is, because sometimes the works kind of merge together a little bit. You wouldn't really mistake one for the other, but there is this feeling that, they had something going on. I don't know how many of you know the parable of the hedgehog and the fox. Any hedgehog fox people out there? The fox knows many, many, many things and does many, many different things in any given day. The hedgehog knows one thing, one big thing only, and sticks to it. I'm not saying that Joan was a hedgehog, because the hedgehog actually had that one big thing, and what it was defense. And that was not Joan, but she had the one big thing. And she kept going, even though the paintings look, you know, seriously different from each other. She had a way of sticking to this one kind of research zone that she was in and making it work for her. And, you know, when I think about it that way, it's like an endless amount of invention. It makes someone like Frank Stella look boring, even though he was trying to be interesting much of the time. So, you know, the hedgehog and the fox, and of course, you know, so Michael was the fox. He was moving around, doing a lot of different things, lots of different media. You know, when I was preparing the text, I said to myself, actually, Michael is one of those people who never met a medium he didn't like. You know, just that's how it seems to me. Anyway, the idea of that goes back to a 1953 book written by Isaiah Berlin called The Hedgehog and the Fox, which is a very good read if you like reading popular philosophy. So we are talking about a hedgehog here. And there. Okay, so the next paragraph is Joan's personal orbiting. And orbits come into all of this slightly more often than you might expect, but she spent time in Boston after she got married in, I think, 1950 to a person who was an engineer. By 1953 or so, they were in Boston and he was doing stuff at MIT. And she was basically either a PhD student or faculty wife or, you know, whatever, but she was thrown in there with all the scientists and all the engineers. At which point all of this, you know, to me makes more sense in terms of what she got into doing. It's all about structure. And subsequent to that, they went to Princeton, presumably for the same reason. And she was more or less feasting on all this exposure to science and engineering and access to ideas, which I think were rolled into her painting. I think that's really where this twist came, because prior to that, and many of the paintings lost in the fire from this earlier period would have been kind of landscapey and whatnot. You know, she I think by 1952, she was starting to do painting. I had somebody I wanted to compare it to. And anyway, but it was like mushy abstract expressionism. And maybe Jack Shadbolt was doing stuff in a similar style around the same time. It's like dark paint and, you know, bright colored paint in it to be light or something like that. But it had none of the hard edge cleanliness at all. It was like, you know, done with a brush. It was mushy. I like to think that she ran into Einstein when they were at Princeton, by the way, because he was there. But I have no way of knowing whether that happened. And that's true for a lot of the stuff that I'm saying here. We just have no way of knowing for sure what took place. Her husband was also one of the engineers who worked on the Granville Street Bridge, if you're crossing over it anytime soon, which opened, I believe, in 1954. So, and then subsequent to that, I think it was 1959 only, she spent time in Central America and Mexico and did what happens to many of us who go down there, and that is that we fall in love with the Maya and we fall in love with their forms. And of course, an awful lot of what the Maya did was sort of hard edge. It's like this carving, and, you know, step-like pyramids going like this. I mean, it's just, you know, endless. Anyway, she was completely exposed to that for some period of time in and around 1959. And that is part of the background to everything. So I don't think Joan read philosophy, but even if she didn't read philosophy, she would have known something about Plato because he's unavoidable. And you know, when I see her paintings, I'm thinking about Plato's theory of forms. So this planet that we live on and all the stuff we see in the sky at night, what is it actually made of? Is it made of something that looks like what we think it looks at because we have the eyes that we have, as opposed to the way it might look to someone from another planet or to a cat? And so the basic idea behind the theory of forms is that in behind everything that we see, even if we see a big structure, there's a whole other level of form going on that we cannot perceive. And it's like the basic form that is pervasive, throughout the entire universe, whereas the forms that we see, this stuff doesn't exist anyplace else but here. So this kind of then crawls into work made by people like Mondrian and Malevich. And, certainly Mondrian has a quote, the great intrinsic values or truths, which remain the same throughout the ages, as physical matter does. We can change our minds about what we think about it, but the truths remain. So, regardless of what Joan knew, other writers and whatnot, she was operating in the context of universals, I think, rather than particulars. So that's another binary break right there. And, when she makes something like these things, she's not actually painting a, particular structure. She's painting an ideal. And that's what I see as the link between Joan and Plato. When I talked to her, she talked about the power of the images and the power that she hoped came out of them as an impact on the people viewing them. But there's a flip side to this also, and that is that the power that I perceived when I was hanging out with her in 2010, doing a bunch of interviews which were not recorded, is that she also exuded power. I mean, she was, I don't know, Sean, may I say this? A tough gal? Was she a tough gal? She really was like, if she wanted to get something done, we would be best advised to stay out of her way because she was going to get it done one way or the other. And so we get power from her work. I know that she got power from her work. When she finished something that she thought was a finished piece, she was like, over the moon about it. And I don't know if other artists are over the moon when they finish a painting. More often than not, you hear about the fact that people don't know when the piece is finished, and then it all of a sudden becomes finished one day because of whatever. I think Joan knew exactly what she was doing, and we'll come back to that in a bit. So I'm kind of positing that Joan thought she was painting universals, things that could be applied anywhere, anytime, any this, any that. And so this would be a time to put up the Al Held there. Look at, okay. So the first painting in Joan's mature style that I know of is from 1965. And here's an Al Held 1965 painting, also called Yellow X or X. And I didn't know about this painting until I was, doing research for this talk. But I thought how amazing it is that they were both in the same year, possibly doing X's. Jones might have been a year or two later, and that he came at it from such a completely different direction, et cetera, et cetera. So, and of course, we have no way of knowing if Joan knew about Al Held's work. So he was one of the many, many, many people who were in shows during the 60s and 70s about whom most of us have never, ever heard. There's a show that I might refer to later called Systemic Painting that was at the Guggenheim in 1966. It had about 40 artists in it. And you'd have to be a really good art historian to have known who 35 of those people were. And the text for the small book that they did was written by Lawrence Alloway. And nobody seemed to notice the fact that the word systemic has a completely different meaning from the word systematic. And sadly, it will take about $300 of your hard-earned money to buy a copy of the book now, because it's rare. It was done in, I think, 2,000 copies. But that kind of break between systemic and systematic, if an artist is being systematic about what they're doing and following the plan, It's actually systematic. It's not systemic, because if something is systemic, it's something that adheres to an already existing system, which we would not want to say about Joan's paintings or anyone else's. So that's a glaring title mistake in my view. I don't know if anybody else has ever brought it up. On orbits and orbitals, the show that I did at SFU, which was called Vancouver Orbital, which is one of my great thefts, because the show was coming about shortly after there was a summertime visit to Vancouver by Ian Sinclair, who had just published his book, which I highly recommend, that's called London Orbital. It's basically Ian working his way around the M25 and just picking up on quirky stuff that he bumps into. And so for a period of a year or two, he would leave his house and go on a 10-hour walk to some portion of the M25 and kind of write a biography about the life forms that he found around it. So that's how the title of the show at SFU came about. In Joan's context, I think, I'll kind of reduce this. Some of the paintings, like this one over here, look like they're done with straight lines. And my memory is that in talking to Joan, that's not how it was. So those forms that you're looking at extend far, far beyond the frame of the painting. And in the way that the distant horizon looks flat, but it's not, or that the orbit of the moon around the Earth, which is 1.5 million miles, if you were to take a 24-inch chunk of it, it will also look flat. My text here talks a lot about fiber optic cables and whatnot, and the way that something carries on beyond the piece of the cable that you can see. And I think Joan was an early anticipator of the look of the fiber optic cables. Anyway, Joan claimed one thing that she always went back to was her absolute passion and amazement about the space program. So this is science and engineering creeping into her life and thinking from yet another direction, more or less from the headlines of the papers. And she became completely obsessed, she told me, with the idea of the space program. And one last thing about all of this is her hard edges, which were very good. I mean, some people might have been better at doing hard edges that are as perfect as you can imagine them being. Hers were very, very good. But by the end of the 70s, we all sort of knew about fractals. And I don't know whether Joan actually knew about fractals or not. But if you can imagine an artist trying to perfect those edges so they are as perfect as possible, it's like an anti-fractal movement, because it cannot be that these are perfectly straight lines. If you zoom in close enough, there's going to be stuff going up and down and little hills and little valleys and everything. And I'm almost positive Joan did not know about them, but I wish she could have, because it just would have been so amazing to her. She had a kind of brain that would have just seized on that and tried to do something with it. And there aren't a lot of fractal artists around, I don't think. The first one that I know about was James Welling, who did photographs that had a whole bunch of geometrical shapes in them. And then he had a thesis about the fractals, and I've forgotten how it worked, but it worked. Just going back to fiber optic cables and all of that, since penning this text, I'm now thinking of them as crooked orbits. So the next chunk is the kind of break between these two people in terms of Michael getting into hard edge from the place you would imagine that he got it from, which is the art world. And all of that hard edge stuff that started happening during the 60s was in the air. And I think you had to work to actually avoid it. I have a hard edge painting hanging on a wall at home, which is the one remnant from me as a painter. It's from 1976. And I was very smart, like really clever. It's got a real hard edge at one point, and all the other edges are really mushy and soft. Yeah. I should have brought a slide, but anyway. So Joan, though, came at it from this whole passion that she had for science and engineering. So she came at what she was doing from a completely different direction. And I don't know if she was actually taking any art magazines at the time. I have absolutely no idea what she knew about. She would be an unlikely subscriber to Art Forum. She might have subscribed to Art News or something like that. And, you know, so all of that. So how's my time? Yes, can you tell if they're bored? Okay. I was told 1 minute and then I got an extension to 5. Anyway, so that's yet another thing. In the same section about this kind of, you know, positivity and whatnot, is another thing about Joan that's quirky. And for those of you who are in the art world, try to think about whether this has ever happened to you with anyone. She never, ever, ever had anything cynical or critical to say about any other artist. And we spent quite a bit of time together. And of course, I wish now that I had recorded all the stuff that went on, but I didn't. She never had a bad word to say about anybody. Like the work that other people were doing, it was the same thing she was doing. They were doing what they cared about. They were trying to figure it out. And it was all extremely refreshing to me to hear an artist talk like that, because not everyone is always kind. And I think that was more true in the 80s than it is now. There were a lot of feisty dinner table discussions in which an artist who was not present did not come out well. And I'm saying that without naming names. So there's the search for purity, the search for an ideal. Joan was part of that. She talked about it. So was part of, without knowing it, of the title of a book that Mark Cheatham came out with in 1991, which is The Rhetoric of Purity. And that book ends, by the way, with Paul Klee. It ends in 1938. And so it actually applies to all the hard edge stuff that came afterwards. And when I first found out that, Klee was the last artist who was in, this text, I thought I had volume 1 of 2, and that Mark was going to go on and actually talk about it. No, it just ends there. So it basically traces the hard edge world backwards. And if you start with chapter 1, you're actually in, I think, 1870. And you would think it wouldn't make sense, but it's a pretty good book. So the purity I think, is not just decluttered representation and non-representational art. It also points to a tendency in painting having more in common with the fabric of the cosmos than what we can see. It's like the kind of imagined world of what keeps things together. And it even transcends the ideas that an artist has, because you can find out a lot of hard edge stuff by looking in science books. They're simply full of it, especially if you're into physics and astronomy. So my idea is that once an artist aspires to the examples that are set by the universe, they end up with art that has no seeming subject, the non-representational, and one that transcends categories and isms. So like, we use the term hard edge, et cetera, but once you look at hard edge as an example and kind of look at it globally, you find out that it's more or less, transnational. You couldn't tell a Dutch hard edge painting from a Canadian hard edge painting, wouldn't be possible unless you recognize someone's style. And so that gets us back to the idea of something that is an image but is universal rather than particular to something or someplace. Okay, here we go. Bye. Lots of interesting stuff about the past. Okay, down here. So the last paragraph is about Joan looking as if she might be a conceptual artist, but I'm saying that she was more like a Saskatoon structuralist. Some of you may remember the magazine that Eli Borenstein, put out called, I think it was called The Structuralist, et cetera, et cetera. And Joan, I would posit, is looking for what in Latin is called the essentia aeterna, the unchanging support for this cosmos that we happen to be living in. And it was basically her wish to share it with other people that made her try to create all of these versions of that essentialism. So I think I can kind of stop there, because we can merge the two of them by talking about letters, because Michael did mail letters and mail art, but Joan only did letters, as did Michael. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you for that. Thank you for those incredible insights onto Joan's life and legacy and its revival. I'll introduce our next speaker. Wayne Baerwaldt is an independent visual arts curator and producer based in Alberta and Saskatchewan. His best-known curatorial projects trace performative elements in art making with an emphasis on unstable, disputed identities in the language of their construction and presentation in public and private spaces. Recent curated projects include If I May Digress, Richard Boulier and Collaborators, Marie Lanoux, In Extremis and Yedessa Helendes, the Grand Hotel for the 60th Venice Biennale. He was guest editor for issue 62 of Public, The Gender Diverse Lens, and conducts ongoing research in social justice issues and questions of representations as a Michelle Serrada artist in residence for socially engaged practice at the University of Regina. He is a board member of the Nita Sheen Foundation, Ottawa, and a member of the Advisory Committee of Participants Incorporated in New York City. And with that, I'll pass it on to you, Wayne.
Is it not on? Now it's on. Thanks, Charlie. I'd like to thank Charlie too, and Geraldine, Karen, of course, for being here. And of course, Brigitte and Henning Freiby for, the opportunity to exchange ideas with you today. It's an honor. And thank you to the Edessa Hendelis Foundation, Art Foundation, and the Flanagan Foundation for supporting my trip here, which is really great. So I'll get right into this. I'm going to talk mostly about Michael and his impact on my curatorial practice. That's kind of my starting point here. So here's Michael. When I reflect on what informs or influences my curatorial practice or process, really, that is, from the initial ideas and forms presented by an artist or collective or situation to the dominant themes and subjects eventually presented as an art exhibition or event, it becomes obvious to me that I have urges to operate beyond academic protocols associated with the study of simply art history and exhibition making. I often think I am something of an outlier this way, because I see the process as a curatorial synthesis of methodologies and frames of reference from multiple disciplines, from art history to urban studies. And I tend to follow the artists who are working in experimental mixed media, following their strategies in art making. I've also gravitated towards artist projects with collaborators who are inclined to realize total works of art, what we used to call Gesamtkunstwerk, often produced over a long period of time. So again, entering the studio or the exhibition with an artist and returning many times over. I also find that I've given some preference to artists producing largely experiential artworks, often removed from the art market and museum collections. I've been fortunate to have a wide range of artists engage me in their studio practices to observe their ongoing research in which social, aesthetic, and political desires shape new work. Most artists offer historical context to the ideas and forms they work with. They connect the dots, so to speak, to have me better understand their work. They may offer archival images, sound, text, anecdotes, and so on to suggest points of departure for their work and to provide an introduction to complex new work evolving in the present moment. The process is often something that cannot be necessarily grasped and recorded initially as art history via documentation, narratives, or archives. There is the emergence of events and situations which can only become known retroactively. To be conscious of the artistic origins of events and situations as a means of tracing the aesthetic threads to precedents, the artist's personal history, the outmoded societal values and sustained prejudices of a living culture. Its process can include the tracing of acts of civil disobedience and calls for civil rights, the ways in which we view the body as a site of social antagonism, and the body as a case, quote unquote, for struggles for recognition and justice. In many ways, I find myself working to recognize the blind spots in the making of art history, where I feel the force of historical matter self-organizing and finding form beyond representation and essence. I've tended to be involved with artists who are discovering new systems for information, exchange, and artist interaction. For me, one of the most significant artists in this undertaking, and you can sort of tell that I'm profiling someone like Michael Morris, I've eventually come to realize that his loosely defined approaches to mixed media interdisciplinary art making act as a strategy of protest by presenting new art objects in different media, sometimes simultaneously, taking them on one by one. And this is the thing or idea that often sits less recognizable, at least initially, beyond the interests of the museum and the art market. I've often gravitated to art activities that resist inclusion in a common and often dominant epistemological framework. To a great degree, this position of protest is one that I have adopted via a lengthy exchange with Michael Morris since 1986. I'm going to briefly profile my pathway to my curatorial practice, which very much involves Michael. And this has just come upon me in the last sort of 6 months of thinking about how influential he's been. I entered the art world as the director-curator of Plug-in Gallery in Winnipeg, an artist-run center, and I brought to the role a background in social art history informed by sociology, city planning, urban design, art history, of course, but a particular type of social art history, of which we often think of Griselda Pollock as one of the leading voices. I was curious about the history of the artist-run center system in Canada, a unique circuit of galleries run primarily by artists rather than curators or administrators. For some reason, I wanted to track the formative ideas that led to the establishment of the artist-driven gallery system. I was informed by a combination of art world gossip, and in particular, an article on Michael's work in General Ideas File magazine. What I knew, among other things, was that Michael co-founded the Western Front in Vancouver, one of the first artist-run centers in Canada, and was the co-curator of a 16-acre fantasy retreat, in my mind at least, and forum for new art called Babyland on the Sunshine Coast. I was interested in meeting him. From my vantage point, Michael presented multiple propositions for art making in various media, in painting, performance art, conceptual, interactive projects such as Image Bank, interactive media artworks, and the propositions were essentially, I think this is interesting, were essentially non-hierarchical. Each had equal weight in which fine craft pottery, for example, could be just as avant-garde as painting. I could tell that Michael followed the creative possibilities of play as revealed in the File magazine documentation of his videos, performances, and interdisciplinary projects that he undertook throughout the 70s. The File magazine article mentioned Babyland, the site of numerous performances, and what I saw as countercultural activities. And the documentation of this suggested it was a retreat for visiting artists, and creatives of all kind. There was the mention of color research, the endless painting, a composition of thousands of painted blocks of wood that could be arranged and rearranged in any number of settings. And from File magazine, I knew the color bar paintings were still circulating, which was really interesting. They weren't necessarily lodged in the 70s and left there. So I traveled to Berlin to meet Michael and his creative partner, Vincent Trassoff, in the fall of 1986. In retrospect, what followed was a series of personal introductions to artists and art world luminaries that defined Michael's generosity, but it was more than a traditional gesture of introductions in the art world, which is something of an old art world sort of sensibility from the 19th and early 20th century. It was about creating a bridge between the past, present, and future. It came from an understanding of art worlds plural, as fluid, as founded on the common ground of creativity and proposition for furthering the impulse for inclusive acts of creativity. Michael's introductions and contextualizing of the making of a contemporary art history was evident in a loosely defined form of performativity via introductions as propositions to elicit action, to elicit exhibitions, events, the making of new projects. One example of his generosity and form of engagement may be enough to give you an idea of how the performative proposition seemed to operate, very informally, without an identifiable structure, but always with expectations for the proposition, the introduction to elicit a creative response. A day after I arrived in Berlin in the fall of 1986, and this is before the wall came down, so it was gray, it was frigid, the East German border guards were nasty. Michael proposed that we leave Berlin by train and make our way to Verona to meet an art collector named Francesco Cons. Well, I'd just gotten there, but I thought, yes, I have to be open to this. Francesco was an eccentric former owner of a furniture factory in northern Italy who had given himself over to art, and specifically to producing art editions with intermedia fluxus artists such as Emmett Williams, Benjamin Patterson, Charlotte Moorman, and others. But it quickly became evident that Michael and Vincent belonged in the same galaxy of artists, perhaps unknown to us in Canada. In no time, I was curating and touring an exhibition of Francesco's editions, producing a catalog, and then in shorter order producing another exhibition and catalog. We'll come back to this photograph, but on the photographs of the influential body artist Pierre Molinier, or Bordeaux-based painter, really, that became known for his photographs of himself and others, which became linked to the body art movement. In many ways, meeting Michael was serendipitous, as his introductions in the art world took place in high and low places, and each precipitated an adventure in curating within the many so-called blind spots in art history, such as Fluxus and such as Pierre Molinier's photographs. You can go on, I think. And another one. And another one, I hope. And another one. There we are. There's Pierre Molinier. I don't have these images in order. Yeah, that's good. The informal meetings shaped my values and beliefs around creative practices in the contested areas of conceptual art, immaterial performance art, and what became lumped into new genre art production. We could go back to Babyland for a second. You could go back further. I think that's good. That's good. Great. The fantasy retreat called Babyland on the Sunshine Coast was co-founded by Michael along with Vincent Trassoff and the master potter Mick Henry. And some of his work, of course, is in the next room here. Again, from my dreamy-eyed vantage point in 1986, Babyland resembled an ideal art retreat where artist-to-artist exchanges took place while cloaked in a decadent, hedonistic lifestyle. Totally appealing in my mind. Babyland was described by Michael as a performative set, a stage, set, or platform and epicenter of a national and international debate on new art and how to activate the ideal of realizing art into life and vice versa. Harold Snyman's exhibition title and radical concept for exhibition making, called Living in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form, from 1969 appears to have been replicated on the set of Babyland to some extent. The bucolic 16 acres of Babyland doubled as a space for critique and making by a long list of visiting artists, including members of General Idea, Harvey Fierstein, if you remember him from Broadway, Kate Craig, Keith Wallace, Roy Arden, and many others who arrived to what seemingly to me was a very open sort of reflection on the seismic shifts in conceptual and intermediate art taking place in the early 70s. They have evinced an interest in exploring myth, persona, and performance. It was part of a project of self-reinvention, of reimagining what art could be, from the opening of the mail to the making and sharing of meals. As with his Western Front colleagues of the time, Michael extolled art as a social rather than aesthetic understanding and undertaking, something that could be realized in a heightened attentiveness to the everyday, but also in the unsettling of bourgeois strictures and conventions, which I think to some extent Michael was very conscious of this. You could pick things up in ways that are sometimes unconscious. This rethinking of its importance as a cipher or portal in making contemporary art history is long overdue. The conceptual base for the project is embedded in the original research of Scott Watson for the Image Bank project, hinting at the greater importance of Babyland as both artist-driven situation and again, set. That said, I think it is more than that. Process remains in the present for me. I like to think that other thinkers and artists will eventually come back to Babyland as a touchstone because truth, or truths in the plural form right now, was something shared in a performative way at Babyland. But also I think we're at this moment where we can't trust language, that words fail us. In some ways we have to start over in terms of the language we use, the discourse around approaching something like Babyland. Was it the same in 1970 at Babyland? I don't know who coined the term post-truth, but that feels like the moment we're in. And if so, does this moment allow us to think differently about what Michael and his collaborators imagined to have transpired at Babyland? So if we just go forward, yeah. But this is a piece called Jericho Atlantis from 1970, a light-on installation piece of Michael's. Again, we see Michael's use of props or sets to engage the viewer in motion around reflective objects, mirrors in this case. This work is open to critique on various levels, but in part I reflect on how it must have been a very now proposition. And Michael is essentially addressing the question of what is history, but it's also an attempt to understand the contextualization of art in the present. It's a reminder of how impossible it is to see an artwork that directly speaks to the time in which it was made, say in 1920 or 1970, in the same way today. What does it mean to represent works out of the context of their time, if they are so much part of their time? We could go back to Michael as in the Miss GI pageant, where he's, I can't recall. No. There we go. Michael worked closely with Toronto's, so this is Michael Morris, his winning, everybody probably knows this image from it's the winning entry of Michael as Miss General Idea in the General Idea beauty pageant. Michael worked closely with Toronto's General Idea, and Michael became a mentor to the artist collective, sharing contacts and art-making strategies with them. A widely reproduced photo of Michael shows him as a pageant winner, as we see here, partially draped in a vintage dress with the hand of the spirit. But the funny thing here is that Michael always said that this image, when it came out and was disseminated in File magazine, was career suicide for him. Although the queer. It's hard to imagine in 2024 that this assemblage of props, the cape, the clear plastic hand of the spirit, the articulated body and hairstyle, could be controversial and generate homophobia. At the time, however, it ended Michael's reputation as a painter, at least for the Canadian institutions that had up until then supported him and his efforts. There were no phone calls returned. It's a reminder of the public museum or art gallery's boundaries, its ability to apply limitations on artists. I find myself thinking a lot about the space of the museum as one that's always about making something crystallize, knowable, ascertainable, especially in the shadow of October 7th, when there are certain boundaries as to what you can speak about and positions you can take. And artists are quite often working against that. So we as curators are engaged in an enterprise that has deep inherent tensions built in. I think the success of many shows that end up having a transgressive effect are shows that try to get closer, to where artists are. Museums are constitutionally adverse to that kind of open-endedness, partly, I think, because they operate as public trusts. Not always, but artists are consistently trying to imagine or articulate a possibility, or maybe you could call it an affirmation of an experience. Michael was dedicated to the experience as what he called the momento mysticos, the sort of mystical moments of revelation and enlightenment. And the source of acknowledgement of the experience remains somehow outside of the making of the object. Time becomes the conduit for the condition to be rebuilt and recognized or better understood. Sometimes the acknowledged shift in meaning happens close to the moment of creation when a piece is first displayed. But sometimes it takes many, many years to be able to see something in a way that's aligned with how the artist imagined it. History is always subject to revision and restoration, and Michael reminded me of that most every time I saw him. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you for your insights on Michael's collective spirit and a state of innovation at all times. I will ask the first question, and then Marie-Ève and Julie, I'll open it up to you as well to ask any questions you may have for each other, and as well as Bill, if you have questions for Wayne, we're here to have a group discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A as well. For the sake of time, I'll ask the same question to the both of you, and I think this sort of echoes what we're seeing here today is this kind of revival of Joan's legacy and an ode to Michael and Image Bank and Babyland and this connection between Victoria that is kind of always hidden that this is the West Coast and not just Vancouver as the city is. Canadian art history tends to write. So I guess my question is, how do you envision the legacy of Michael and of Joan influencing generations of artists and scholars to come? Quite a broad question, but.
Well, Joan has to become famous first. Yeah. Not everybody knows about her. So there's work to be done. More museums need to step up and try to make something out of what she's left us.
It goes back to something you said earlier about publishing. And I think Al Hansen and many others have said publish or perish. And it's absolutely true. We don't think so much about, hard copy catalogs now. We're kind of wondering if they're actually necessary, but to have something out there digitally, free, downloadable, is so important. And I guess we don't see that yet with Joan's work. There isn't a blockbuster catalog or documentation that's accessible enough.
If there's anyone here who wants to fund the Joan Balzar catalog raisonné, please meet me after the talk. Okay.
And just, this idea of the legacy of the artist and how do you preserve the preservation of their history, and is so tragic that so much of Joan's work and documentation was lost due to the fire. And but what can be done to counter this loss? So you're saying the publication for sure, because that's how future researchers can access. But I guess in terms of like, say, locating surviving works and existing works of Joan's and I guess putting on more exhibitions. So maybe Marie-Ève could put on an exhibition in Montreal, for example. But yeah, I guess like my question is for all four of you in terms of like thinking about keeping a legacy alive, like Marie-Ève, if you can talk a little bit more about how Molinari in the last years of his life had efforts to create a foundation that would be a center that not only preserves this work, but also engages with contemporary artists and contemporary historians and researchers. And then Wayne, with the recent passing of Michael, it's a poignant moment to reflect on his legacy and given the significant impact of his work and practice on Canadian art scene, what further steps can be taken to ensure his contributions are preserved, celebrated, and what can we learn from the challenges that come up, and better safeguard and promote, the legacies of these artists?
Well, I know a little something about the Michael Morris estate. Rami Eman is here today, and he's in discussions with quite a range of people as to what are the next steps for making Michael's work better known. Not necessarily through publications. There are great publications quite over the last 10, 12 years that have come out. Fantastic publications that put his work in a historical perspective. But his work still isn't in a lot of collections, public collections. There could be more work that goes into private collections, for example. The estate itself could be behind developing new narratives that are more 2024 about the influence of Michael's work on younger artists, for example, or established artists even. But just the legacy of his ideas, I don't think the narratives around Babyland have been developed yet. I think something happened there that, in my mind at least, in my imagination, is more like an idealistic retreat where it was kind of a brokering house for ideas about art for the future. So I want to do a little more research on that and to interview, beginning this summer actually, interview a whole range of people on the experience of Babyland and what kind of work, of course there were artworks, but the kind of ideas that were generated in that setting. So I know the estate is interested in this, and I think that's one thing that absolutely has to be done. And with Joan?
One thing about Babyland that I'll say, which I think most people know, is that it was named Babyland for a reason. It was almost as if it was before birth control existed. Yes. There were
prenatal identity.
There were a lot of babies running around.
Just a comment.
Whose land he had a nursery in front of where Babyland was.
See, many stories. Many stories.
I'll be interviewing you this summer, by the way. And, right.
Marie-Ève, would you like to?
I could offer like a brief answer, but touring projects, I mean, is one of the most important thing in our very large country. I had the feeling that maybe in the 60s, 70s, it was a process and an attitude that was more, common. In the last decades, I feel a lot of institutions have worked by themselves to create their own content, but unfortunately, there are less touring projects. around between not only museums, but institutions in general, artist-run centers too. And I truly think that this type of collaboration would help a lot to make sure that we know more the legacy, but also that we are able to understand how in our communities ideas travel with artists.
I have a question, but before I ask mine, I want to ask Julie if you had a question.
Yeah, I have one. Looking at the paintings from Joan and from Michael, what struck me as a Montrealer was a big difference between their work and the paintings that were made at the time in Montreal, where painters like Tousignan, Molinari, and Gaucher were very much engaged with the flatness of the work and the Greenberg ideas of the painting being worked on in the flatness. And I see a lot of play with the spaces in their work, depth, and also borrowing colors and imagery, either from language or pop culture or scientific culture. And I would like you to expand on this aspect of their work, and maybe knowing a bit more what the influences in painting were at the time in Vancouver.
Yeah,
Thanks. In an attempt to try to answer Julie's question, I would give an observation that there seems to be a moment in Vancouver, and we'll say we could call it 1966, maybe 1967. Michael comes back from London. He brings with him some ideas that we, as were noted through Harold Cohen and other artists, we see British pop influences that then get manifest in a whole bunch of artists. Bodo Pfeiffer was named. I'm thinking of Reg Holmes, Brian Fisher. There was a whole number of artists. So I think that there's a split between the early 60s, where we could see more manifest a kind of abstraction that comes about through, let's say, loosely Jack Shadbolt's ideas about abstraction, or Don Harvey, if you want to talk about Victoria. And then what happens in the later part of the 60s, which gets presented in a whole bunch of ways. I think it's correct to note that there's a London, LA, Vancouver nexus, and New York that gets played out through the gallery exhibitions that happened here in the late 60s. It's nice to see that there was this link to Montreal, because I think it's true. But I think the kind of abstraction that was made in Montreal was very different than the abstraction that was made here, as Julie has noted.
Do either of you have follow-up to that, or should we open it up to questions from the audience?
I just wanted to ask Wayne if you would unpack a little bit more about Michael's influence on your curatorial practice, because I know that he was very influential, and maybe even some specific projects that you can sort of connect to his more kind of multidisciplinary kind of approach to his curatorial work as well?
Well, Michael had a great sense of, or a great take on art history and his place in that art history, and always encouraged younger artists to find yourself in contemporary art history. That's very interesting. So people like Taras Politaiko, the Ukrainian-Canadian artist, became quite close to Michael, and Michael would give advice, basically, or provide a forum for debate on contemporary Ukrainian history and how that should be represented by the artist. I thought that was interesting, and most recently did a sort of a mini survey going back 25 years to that point where Michael was influential on Taras's work. And I didn't really think about it so much at the time. But of course, with the more recent iterations of the war in Ukraine in 2014 and now today, of course, his work is absolutely relevant in a very different way. I think Michael helped to bring an understanding of Taras's representation to I don't know, to public attention in a certain way that where it was seemingly invisible in the past. I think that was a big thing. That's one example. I always thought too that Michael, you know, and especially Rita, his mother, sort of bridged the 20th and 21st centuries in an interesting way. She knew the First World War, she knew the Second World War, she knew the Cold War. I think she brought a sense of trauma with her from old England, old Europe. And Michael sort of lived through that too in a way. You search for security, a safe place in a funny way. So in a strange way, he had me thinking about trauma in different ways. So that, for example, I to some extent influenced by Michael, a project with Richard Boulay, an artist who deals with fine craft textile work and language out of Edmonton, working with John Cage's work, Kenneth Patchen, Gertrude Stein's work in a form of cross-stitching to sort of suppress the sort of anxiety associated with the schizophrenia. But wonderful, wonderful work, but again, coming out of trauma. And even more recently, I'm working on a project with Edessa Hendelis out of Toronto, who brings, you know, a certain understanding of post-Holocaust trauma into her work, notions of displacement, dispossession, forced migration, and the sort of reading of materiality that's needed to make her installations. I think it kind of goes back to Michael having me look differently at materials, performativity, photographs differently, all kinds of materials in a certain way that, again, brings this sort of understanding to his understanding of art history to life. And I don't know what that process is. You can't really put your finger on it, but it kind of enters your unconscious methodology to looking at art and making sense of the world.
Thank you. I had a question, and I know the both of you briefly touched on letters and lettering and Joan's use of letters in a very different way from Michael's use of the distribution of letters. And I thought, would you like to expand maybe a little bit about Image Bank and Joan's particular use of letters in her work?
Well, I think the main quirk with probably every language is that you can have the same word meaning so many different things. And so we have letters as things that are mailed, and then we have letters, millions of which are piled up in one book, you know? So it makes no sense actually to have the same word for the two things, but you can imagine in the year 1400, maybe 1450, when the first postal systems, the thing that you were sending to someone else was a sheet with a bunch of letters on it. I mean, it could have been called sentences, I think.
Sorry, if I could just add to that. In the 60s, Studio International, which was this London published magazine, had a section at the back which was letters. So New York letter, Rome letter, New York letter, and so on. And Michael picked up on this idea and started titling his paintings. This is probably commonly known in the exhibition that Scott did at the Belkin of the letter paintings, including the one that was shown of the Montreal letter, was used as a title by Michael, riffing on the Studio International, but also making a link to an international idea, which is a very different idea than the way in which Joan used letters. And in particular, we have this one painting here of the W, I'll call it, letter, or the X's.
I think at the time too, Scott Watson has pointed this out, this sort of discourse that Michael had and others had with the periphery speaking to the center and the center speaking to the periphery. So I think those letters are being sent by Michael to the center, so to speak, but also at the same time showing a certain level of confidence, you know, in this work, the boldness of the statement through the materials, using mirrors, plexiglass, photographic reproductions of lines in black and white, sending that as a very powerful statement in a funny way back to the center, as if we are engaging with the center. We're part of the discourse. We're not separate. We're not less than. I think that it was a very confident way of constructing a letter to, you know, this abstract center, these other voices of authority in the art world.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have time for one last question.
Thanks. I guess more of a comment than a question. I kind of also just, when I heard about this exhibition, I've just seen it for the first time today. I was reminded of a visit to the Belkin years ago, and I walked into this exhibition, and I thought it was Joan Balzar, but it was Michael Morris because of these, you know, this series of works, you know, very similar to this other series. I don't know if some of those of Michael's that are more vertical, and I can't remember the name of those series, but that parallel is just fascinating. But I guess that my question is more related to Michael's role as a curator. You know, he curated at the Vancouver Art Gallery in the 1960s. He curated shows at the Belkin in the 70s, like I'm thinking of the mail art show around 1970 maybe, or the postal art show, mail art show, and others later at the Western Front in certain ways, and Babyland and Berlin probably. Like, I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on how he negotiates that, because I've seen and come across artists who have dabbled in curating, and in some ways it had negative effects on their career as an artist, as an administrator, and he was able to do both. And he kind of going back to your comment about the fox characteristic of, he was able to do so much, but that relationship between being a curator and an artist, I'm wondering if maybe you could comment on that.
Michael absolutely took on that role as a curator / advisor. So if you think of Attila Richard Lukasz's work, the development of his work in the 80s into the 90s, it's sort of common knowledge that Michael is also in the studio commenting and guiding Attila's sort of understanding of the pictorial space and making sense of it historically, you know, in every way possible. So then you also see the Polaroids that came out of Attila's studio. Michael is the one that arranged all of the Polaroids and made sense of every page that was reproduced in this quite significant chunky catalog that we produced with the Art Gallery of Alberta through the Illingworth Kerr Gallery at the Alberta College of Art and Design. So again, Michael plays a certain role as a curator, doesn't necessarily follow through with the making of an exhibition, but you can tell where he's involved in the background and how work comes together and is made sense of, as a curator would do, but he does it in such an informed way as an artist advisor. So yeah, he's that sort of side to his influence is has been underplayed to a great extent. Those early shows that you've pointed out, but there are other examples that should be highlighted.
I think there's one more question from Lisa. I just wanted to direct this one to Marie-Eve and Julie. Thank you both so much for taking the time to get to know this history and meeting us somewhere halfway across the country. Maybe we're hovering somewhere over Winnipeg or something right now and trying to meld these minds together. But Marie-Eve, I wondered about, having found all the intersections that you did, if you feel that there are any shifts in your understanding as well, like noting these sort of moments of punctum between the Joan's work and also Michael's work and the work that you've been doing with Molinari and his collection. And for Julie, I know this was a discovery with Joan, but such a solid inquiry in terms of your own inquiry. So I wondered if you might say a few words in terms of this intersection of optics, light, abstraction, and what you see maybe the next legacy is, the next stage in this kind of inquiry for yourself and new artists.
Thank you for your question. I may go first, but briefly. Now, this research was truly interesting, and I would say especially to discover the work of Joan Balzar, which is not at all known more east for us, for my generation especially. Concerning Michael Morris and Molinari's legacy, I mean, it's so clear how the two artists are fundamentally different in their definition of abstraction. In some conversations, especially the ones between David McWilliams and the artists, I've read in the 80s that for Morris in Vancouver, the geography and the beauty of the place was a major influence. And then later on, of course, the society and this fluidity when you were talking about, I mean, concerning the conception of abstraction for la deuxième génération, the second generation of plasticiens, all this context is totally evacuated. So that's why I realized how the path of influence between East and West were much more North and South than East and West in a way. It was very clear for me. But concerning the work that we take care to develop at the Fondation, it's for us very, very important to create these contexts of trans-historical dialogues, but this context has to be developed in resonance and also in dissonance with the legacy of the artist, because we have to consider how history has to be built, feed with what is complémentaire, similar, but also with what could be the total opposite or fundamentally different in terms of attitude. So, yeah.
Yeah, for me, what I get from this whole experience of learning about Joan and Michael is more in terms of an artistic attitude, and it made me reflect on what is some important aspect for me of an art practice, especially the connection, the linkage that you have with your professors and the people that came before you, your peers, and the people that comes after you. Although I found the work really interesting and exciting, but I guess because it dates back from the 60s and the 70s, maybe what I get is more this importance of the relationships between the artist and nurturing spaces for creativity outside of the what is the expectations of the market or the institutions. I think it's really inspiring to see how Joan has worked without showing her work that much, but pursue her practices or practice despite this, and also the Babyland experience. And so yeah, that's what I get the most from the learning about these two artists.
Thank you both for those wonderful in-depth answers. And thank you all for joining us here today. Thank you, Julie and Melia, for joining us from Montreal, and Bill and Wayne for being here in person, and Karen for your thoughtful moderation, and Charlie, who we could not do this without. This is very complicated tech, so thank you to Charlie for all your help, and Geraldine for assisting us here today, and to David and William as the curators of the exhibition, and again to you all, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your Sunday. Oh, and the exhibition runs until May 5th. Intersecting Orbits is open till May 5th. Thank you.
Both so much. Thank you both so much, Julie and Marie, for all your research and for being with us today. We so appreciate it. We wish you could be here, but maybe next time you're in Vancouver, we'll meet in person.
Definitely.
I would have loved to see Joan Balzar and Michael Morris' works in real, but the walkthrough was great to watch. So thank you for
I
this
just want to
great
say
invite.
thank you to you both. So great.
Yeah.
Maria, I really
Thank
enjoyed
you
your
much.
presentation. Julie, so great to see you again.
Me too.
It must be hard from a distance, so thank you.
Au revoir.
Thank you again so much. Please come and visit us, and we'll do the same if we're in Montreal.
Yeah, you're always welcome. Au revoir.
Thank you.